Welcome to HOA, Crimes and Punishments. Imagine dedicating your life to upholding the law, protecting your community, and serving with honor, only to face betrayal not from criminals on the streets, but from a group that was supposed to safeguard the order of your own neighborhood. This is not merely a tale of petty disputes over lawn height or the color of a front door. This is the story of how a homeowners association, blinded by greed and arrogance, dared to challenge the wrong man by attempting to take away the very home of a police officer. What unfolded was not just a clash of rules and regulations, but a profound confrontation between justice and abuse of power. In communities across the country, homeowners associations were originally created with the intention of maintaining standards, protecting property values, and ensuring harmony within neighborhoods. On paper, this seems like a noble concept: neat lawns, uniform designs, safety, and order. But beneath the glossy brochures and promises of community pride, HOAs often evolve into powerful micro-governance, issuing fines with little oversight, enforcing arbitrary rules, and at times, overstepping their authority in ways that disrupt lives. The officer, the center of this story, believed that by moving into such a community, he was securing peace for himself and his family. A quiet street, well-kept homes, a sense of belonging after long shifts dedicated to law enforcement. Yet soon he would discover that the very association meant to maintain tranquility was prepared to strip him of the most important possession a person can hold: his home. The escalation from small fines to the threat of foreclosure was not simply an administrative matter. It was a violation of trust and a reckless display of unchecked power. The opening chapter of this ordeal was deceptively simple: a notice left at the door, a fine for grass deemed too long, a claim that the appearance of the property was somehow unacceptable to the standards of the board. For an ordinary homeowner, such a notice might be shrugged off or quietly paid to avoid conflict. But for someone trained to read between the lines, someone who had witnessed how small abuses can grow into systemic corruption, this was more than just an inconvenience. It was the first red flag in what would become a prolonged and exhausting battle. When additional fines began to appear, the pattern became impossible to ignore: a fee for the wrong shade of paint on the mailbox, a penalty for parking a truck in the driveway, a citation for blinds that supposedly did not match the approved style. Each accusation was couched in official language, backed by pages of HOA bylaws, yet each one seemed less about community harmony and more about control. By the time the threat of foreclosure was issued, it was clear that the HOA had shifted from regulation to intimidation. What makes this confrontation extraordinary is not merely the audacity of the HOA, but the resilience of the man they targeted. While many would panic, seek hurried legal advice, or cave under pressure, this officer quietly began to collect evidence. He documented every notice, every conversation, every unjustified penalty. He reviewed the bylaws meticulously, cross-referenced them with state laws, and prepared for the inevitable showdown. What the HOA miscalculated was that their victim was not just any homeowner. He was a professional accustomed to gathering evidence, analyzing patterns, and presenting airtight cases in front of judges. The attempted seizure of his home became the turning point. When representatives of the HOA tried to enforce their foreclosure notice, they were met not with fear, but with a calm defiance grounded in preparation. Court filings followed, legal procedures were triggered, and suddenly the HOA found themselves in a position they had never anticipated. The very structures they had manipulated to harass others were now being used to hold them accountable. The courtroom became the stage where arrogance met discipline. An unchecked authority was confronted by the very principles of justice they had hoped to sidestep. Throughout this ordeal, the neighbors watched. Some were sympathetic but afraid to speak. Others whispered about their own grievances with the HOA but lacked the courage to resist. Yet when the truth came to light in court, when evidence was presented showing a pattern of harassment, selective enforcement, and abuse of power, the narrative shifted. The officer was not merely defending his own property. He was exposing a deeper rot within the system, one that could affect anyone who thought they were safe within their own walls. The eventual judgment was not just a victory for one man. It was a statement, a declaration that even in the seemingly small arenas of neighborhood governance, principles of fairness and justice cannot be trampled. The HOA's attempt to strip away his home backfired, leaving them humiliated, legally constrained, and financially burdened. Their mistake was not only targeting the wrong individual, but underestimating the strength of truth and persistence. And so, this speech unfolds as both a cautionary tale and a reflection on power. It is a reminder that vigilance is necessary, that authority without accountability will always drift toward abuse, and that even in the smallest of communities, the struggle between control and freedom remains very real. The pressure began to mount as the notices kept coming, each one stamped with official insignia and written in a tone that left no room for negotiation. At first it was the lawn, then the mailbox, then the blinds inside the home that allegedly did not conform to the uniform aesthetic. The most ordinary details of daily life were transformed into weapons of control, each violation carrying with it a fine, each fine compounding into a growing financial burden. What seemed like an inconvenience at first had now evolved into a targeted campaign. For many in such communities, the slow accumulation of fines leads to resignation. People pay, often begrudgingly, because the alternative seems exhausting and uncertain. Yet what the association failed to understand was that their chosen target was no ordinary resident. He was patient, deliberate, and trained to recognize patterns of harassment. Every notice that arrived at his doorstep was carefully documented, photographed, filed, and cross-referenced. He said little, but behind closed doors he was constructing an unshakable defense. The association, emboldened by silence, assumed their tactics were effective. The letters grew harsher, threatening liens against the property, hinting at foreclosure if payments were not made. Meetings were held where board members spoke with increasing arrogance, convinced they held ultimate power over one of their own residents. Their mistake lay in confusing quiet resilience with weakness. The day came when the foreclosure threat arrived in writing. For the average homeowner, this would have been a moment of despair, a time when fear took hold and rational thought slipped away. Yet this was the moment he had been preparing for. Instead of panic, he responded with calm precision. The notice was catalogued, reviewed, and immediately placed into the growing body of evidence that told a story of systematic abuse. Neighbors began to whisper. Some had faced similar harassment but had chosen to comply rather than resist. Others watched from a distance, unwilling to involve themselves but secretly hoping that someone would finally stand up to the relentless control of the association. The silence of the community was heavy, but within that silence was anticipation, a hope that someone would expose the excesses they had all suffered under. When representatives of the association attempted to act on their threat, they discovered the first cracks in their plan. Instead of a frightened resident, they found themselves confronted with legal filings, court dates, and formal challenges that forced them into a system where their power was suddenly limited. What they had wielded unchecked within the neighborhood was now subject to the scrutiny of judges, statutes, and due process. For the first time, they were not the highest authority in the room. The courtroom became the true battleground. On one side sat the representatives of the association, accustomed to dictating terms and expecting compliance. On the other stood a man who had spent years in uniform, years preparing cases, years presenting facts before skeptical judges. He was not just defending a home, he was constructing a case that laid bare the hypocrisy, the double standards, and the manipulations that had long gone unchallenged. As the evidence was presented, the narrative shifted. Pages of fines were revealed to be inconsistently applied, with some residents punished while others committed the same violations without consequence. Testimonies exposed personal biases, grudges, and petty politics disguised as enforcement of community standards. Financial records suggested misuse of association funds, further eroding the credibility of those who had styled themselves as guardians of order. The turning point came when the pattern of harassment was made undeniable. What had begun as small, almost laughable fines had escalated into an attempt to strip a man of his home. The judge, faced with a mountain of documented evidence, could not ignore the conclusion. This was not fair governance. This was abuse. The ruling was clear. The foreclosure was denied. The association's fines were struck down. Legal fees were ordered to be covered by the very board that had pursued the case. The courtroom, once a place of tension, now carried a sense of release, of justice finally being served. The fallout spread quickly through the community. Word traveled from neighbor to neighbor, each conversation laced with a mix of relief and vindication. The officer's victory was not just his own. It was a victory for every resident who had ever felt powerless in the face of the association's overreach. It was proof that silence did not mean surrender, that even the most entrenched systems of petty power could be dismantled with persistence, preparation, and courage. For the association, the humiliation was severe. No longer could they wield fines as freely. No longer could they assume unquestioned authority. Their credibility had been shattered in the most public way possible. What they had intended as a demonstration of strength had become a lesson in limits. In the quiet aftermath. As life in the neighborhood resumed, the true meaning of the battle became clear. It was never just about grass height, mailbox color, or blinds. It was about control. It was about the dangerous temptation that arises when power is granted without accountability. And it was about the reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, remains a force that can never be permanently silenced. So let this story serve as both warning and inspiration. To those who wield power, remember that every decision carries weight, and arrogance will eventually meet its reckoning. To those who feel trapped, remember that silence is not weakness when it is accompanied by preparation and resolve. And to every community that places authority in the hands of a few, remember that true order is never maintained through fear, but through fairness. If you enjoyed this unbelievable HOA story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to HOA Crimes and Punishments, and share it with friends who love true justice stories. If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who need to hear the truth, and subscribe to HOA Crimes and Punishments for more real stories that expose the hidden battles inside our neighborhoods. Your support helps us bring you even deeper investigations and powerful stories. Stay alert, stay aware, and remember, knowledge is your best protection.